2,500 years ago in China, there was a brilliant strategist who left us hundreds of famous quotes that are still valid today. In one of them, Sun Tzu commented that, "The best victory is to win without fighting." This sentence summarizes what so many countries, kingdoms, and empires have tried to do throughout history, which is basically to obtain all their victories using their diplomacy. To give an example, and although both the Greeks and the Romans used it before them, Attila the Hun used intimidation to a great extent so that all kinds of cities or kingdoms surrendered to him without fighting. Basically what they did was take some cavalry soldiers in the vanguard, who went to the cities through which Attila's army was going to pass, and told all kinds of terrifying stories. With this they intended to instill fear in the enemy side and cause them to surrender without having to fight. As we are going to see below, in each period of history, technological means and available resources have been used to propagate all kinds of ideas, in order to intimidate an enemy in such a way that they refuse to fight. So on today's show, we're going to look at how important this type of psychological warfare was during World War II, and all the advantages and disadvantages it had for each side. First of all, if there is a country that used this type of strategy, it was undoubtedly Germany. In fact, their propaganda campaigns were so successful that they still endure today. Whenever there is talk of the successes of the German army, during the campaigns in Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Barbarossa, reference is made to the so-called Lightning War. This emphasizes that the Germans concentrated all their forces, and all their firepower in one place to defeat their enemy militarily. However, little is said about the ability they had to intimidate their enemies and provoke their surrender before the combat even began, or in the worst case shortly after it began. Every time the Germans attacked in any campaign that we have just named, their main objective, rather than defeating their enemies militarily, was to defeat them psychologically. To do this, they resorted to encircling and isolating them, and using totally overwhelming firepower on them, until they were convinced that the only option they had was to surrender. It is with this type of measures that the slow and costly wars of attrition are avoided. With each victory that is obtained, the fame of your army increases, and the enemies are more and more intimidated, so everything works in your favor. Obviously, when you are defeated multiple times, the opposite also occurs. After the triumphant campaigns of the German army in Poland, Denmark, and Norway, it was the turn of France. During said operation, there is a multitude of testimonies in which the Germans affirmed that many French units fled before the notices of the arrival of their panzer divisions. Later during Operation Barbarossa, those same Germans were very surprised when they saw that the Soviet soldiers were much tougher and more resistant than those they had faced before. The expression that arose to point out this characteristic was that the Russians had to be killed twice. Basically, it alludes to the fact that when they managed to overcome and isolate the Soviet units, they continued fighting despite the fact that their situation was completely lost. We have to remember that the fear instilled by the German army in mid-1941 was so great that all military analysts, whether German, British or American, had predicted that the Red Army would collapse in 5 or 6 weeks. In any case, one of the best examples of how to obtain a great victory with hardly having to fight, we have it in the action carried out by Lieutenant Klingenberg of the Das Reich Division, who with only 6 men managed to make Belgrade surrender to make them believe that numerous units of the German army had entered the city. After these spectacular conquests of 1939, 1940, and early 1941, it seemed that the German army was invincible. One of the most widespread propaganda myths was that their army was fully motorized, and that their technology was superior to that of any country, and it goes without saying that the number of tanks they had was countless. This is how the Spanish from the Blue Division believed it when they joined the German army, although it took them a very short time to realize that this was not the case. In any case, it is clear that this element is one of the most important, and in most cases it is the one that decides whether or not a country enters the war, and the resistance capacity of an army whose most important element is the moral. It was around the end of 1942, when the turn of the war took place, when these propaganda devices became more important than ever. Although the use of propaganda leaflets that are bombed over enemy lines is something that was already used from the beginning of the war, from this date they were used with greater frequency and ferocity. The main objective of these leaflets is to reduce the morale of the enemy soldiers and cause their desertion or withdrawal. Although at first very generic messages were launched, little by little they were perfected to have the greatest possible effect on the enemy. The key to everything is to write down ideas and feelings with which the enemy soldiers feel completely identified. To achieve this, the recently captured prisoners are interrogated and their needs and desires are studied. Based on this information, very emotional texts are written with which the enemy is bombarded, making them feel completely identified. If that enemy troop is short of food, they will be offered food if they surrender. If they are getting cold, they will be offered warmth and shelter. If they are afraid to surrender because they have heard about the brutal treatment of prisoners, they will be told about how well surrendering soldiers are treated. If the soldiers have been fighting for a long time and what they want most is to go home to their families, they will be told that as soon as they surrender and the war is over, they will be sent home to their families. And so we could continue with any other matter. On the other hand, this type of psychological warfare against enemy troops focuses on making the enemy soldier believe that his country is defeated, and that the one he is facing is far superior. In the same way, each country will tell its men that victory is close and that a last effort is needed, whatever the situation. To give us an idea, Goebbels himself was sending messages until the same month of April 1945 in which he told his soldiers that if each small unit was capable of organizing an attack on the enemy, however small it might be, even they could turn the situation around. False information was also given that New York and London were destroyed by the new V-2 rockets, and that their surrender was near. However, when everything goes so badly that it is difficult to raise the morale of the troops, the last element that is resorted to is to make the soldier see that no matter how bad his situation is, it will be even worse if he falls into trouble. Enemy hands. This affected the Germans and Soviets alike, as both knew the ferocity with which they treated each other, and were aware that if they were taken prisoner they would not last long alive. This element was stronger than any other, and kept them fighting during the most adverse situations. Stalin himself came to complain about this matter, because he did not want the Germans to see the Americans or the English as his favorite side when it came to surrender. So he made efforts to make the Germans believe that they would be treated better than the Americans. After seeing this type of propaganda that was mainly distributed through leaflets, we must also talk about the one that was disseminated through radio programs. In the first place, to capture the attention of the enemy soldiers, songs that were very popular among them were broadcast, to later move on to dialogues in which the feelings and desires of the soldiers were attacked. Actually, these programs were not intended to tell blatant lies as in the flyers, but sought to fully empathize with the audience to reduce their morale and desire to fight. By way of conclusion, we have to say that winning a victory in war for the minds and hearts of an army or a civilian population can be tremendously more effective than any military victory. That is why the censorship services are always so ruthless, because they know full well that any thought or idea, no matter how small, can pose a great danger in the future if it is allowed to circulate freely. And it is that, and as is well known, the pen is more powerful than the sword. Well, I hope this video has made you reflect on the importance of this type of war, which is never taken into account since the battles, the weapons, and the military strategies are always more striking. We say goodbye here. Thank you all for being part of this community, and especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and we'll see each other here as always, next Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.